The first 2 weeks in my new home had been a whirlwind of unpacking, organizing, and discovering all the quirks that come with a house you've never lived in before. I'd already learned that the back door stuck when it rained, that the upstairs bathroom faucet whistled if I turned it on too quickly, and that the neighborhood was quieter than I had dared hope for, at least at first glance. I had chosen this property for one very specific reason. It was not under the jurisdiction of the homeowners association that governed most of the other houses on the street. The realtor had pointed that out proudly, almost as if it was a selling feature, and I had smiled, knowing I'd dodged a bullet. No HOA meant no ridiculous rules about what color I could paint my shutters, how tall my grass could grow, or whether I could plant a garden without begging for permission. It meant freedom, privacy, and peace. Or so I thought. That illusion shattered one sunny morning when I was working on setting up a few flower beds in the backyard. The air was crisp, the sky a cloudless blue, and I had a playlist humming through my phone while I dug into the soil. I was just deciding where to place a row of tulips when I heard a loud, deliberate knock on my front door, sharp, insistent, and entirely too aggressive for a casual visit. I wiped my hands on my jeans side and walked around to the front yard, where the sound had already escalated into pounding. When I opened the door, there she was, the woman I had seen strutting around the neighborhood like she owned it. Medium height, mid-50s, with a perfectly pressed blouse tucked into khaki slacks and a pair of oversized sunglasses perched on her head like a crown. She carried a clipboard, of course, because people like her never go anywhere without one, and her entire posture radiated authority she clearly thought she had. Before I could greet her, she pushed past the threshold of politeness and declared, "I need to inspect your backyard immediately." I blinked, taken aback by both the rudeness and the sheer audacity. "I'm sorry, what?" She gave me a look usually reserved for naughty children. As president of the HOA, it is my duty to ensure that no unapproved structures or landscaping are being installed. Several residents have reported that you are constructing fencing and altering the yard without authorization. I couldn't help but laugh, though I try to keep it polite. First of all, I'm planting flowers. Second, this property isn't under your HOA. You don't have any authority here. Her face tightened, and she jabbed a finger toward me like an attorney presenting evidence. Every single property in this neighborhood falls under our jurisdiction. You cannot simply exempt yourself from the rules that keep this community beautiful. I stepped forward, blocking her view of the house as she craned her neck to try to peek inside. Actually, yes, I can. I did my research before buying. My deed clearly states that this property is outside the HOA boundaries. I'm not under your rules. That hit her like a slap. Her eyes widened, and she opened and closed her mouth a few times before regaining her composure. "That's impossible. There must be a mistake in your paperwork. Nobody is allowed to live here without HOA oversight. It's what ensures harmony." "Call it whatever you want," I said calmly, "but the fact remains, you have no right to demand access to my backyard. This is private property." Her nostrils flared. "If you have nothing to hide, you'll let me in. Otherwise, I'll assume you're violating our bylaws, and I'll have to escalate this situation." I crossed my arms. "Assume whatever you like. You're not stepping 1 foot past this point without my permission, and you're not getting it." For a moment, she just stared at me, stunned that anyone had dared talk back to her. Then her face turned crimson, and she stomped her foot, so hard I felt it vibrate through the porch. "Fine," she snapped. "If you refuse to comply, I'll have no choice but to call the authorities. You'll regret this." "Go ahead," I said evenly. "You'll be wasting their time, not mine." She gasped, as though the very idea of being challenged was an insult. "We'll see about that," she hissed. "This kind of behavior will not be tolerated in my neighborhood." I almost pointed out that it wasn't her neighborhood, but I bit my tongue. Instead, I simply shut the door, leaving her sputtering on the other side. Through the window, I watched her stomp down my driveway, heels clacking like a furious metronome, muttering loud enough for half the block to hear. She paused at the curb, yanked out her phone, and started dialing furiously. I shook my head and went back to the backyard, though the peace of the morning had evaporated. Every time I plunged the shovel into the soil, I imagined her face turning redder, her hands gripping that clipboard until her knuckles went white. I tried to laugh it off. After all, what could she really do? She had no legal grounds, no jurisdiction, and no authority over my property. But there was something unnerving about her confidence, as if she truly believed she could bend the world to her will just by shouting loudly enough. Over the next 20 minutes, I noticed subtle movements from the other houses. Curtains twitching, front doors opening just a crack, neighbors pretending to water their lawns while sneaking glances toward my house. Clearly, word was spreading fast. In a way, I didn't blame them. This wasn't just about me. It was about Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, finally meeting someone who refused to bow down. I thought that would be the end of it, that she would stomp home and sulk until she found some new outlet for her energy. But then I heard the unmistakable sound of her voice from the front yard again, this time raised and filled with triumph. "Yes, officer, I need you to come immediately. We have a resident refusing to comply with HOA regulations and obstructing an official inspection." My heart sank. She had actually called the police. I dropped the shovel, brushed the dirt from my hands, and leaned against the fence, letting the absurdity of it all sink in. This woman was truly unhinged. She wasn't satisfied with fake fines or angry notes. Now she was weaponizing law enforcement in her desperate attempt to control me. I took a deep breath, reminded myself that I had nothing to fear, and went inside to pull out the folder I'd prepared for exactly this scenario. Copies of my deed, the plat map, and the county paperwork proving beyond any doubt that my property was not and never had been part of HOA. If she wanted a showdown, she was about to get one. I didn't have to wait long after she made her phone call. About 25 minutes later, the faint wail of sirens floated down the street before fading into the sound of tires crunching against asphalt. When I peeked through my blinds, I spotted exactly what I had expected, a black and white cruiser pulling up to the curb in front of my house. Two officers stepped out, their body language calm and professional. And trailing just behind them, like a general leading her troops, was Karen, strutting across my lawn with the smugness of someone who thought she'd finally caught her nemesis in a trap. I opened the front door before they could knock, trying to head off the inevitable theatrics. "Good morning, officers," I said, evenly holding the folder of documents under my arm. "What seems to be the problem?" One of the officers, a tall man with a patient expression, spoke first. "We received a call from this lady here. She says there's a dispute regarding access to your property for an HOA inspection." Karen immediately jumped in, cutting him off. "Not a dispute, an outright refusal. He won't allow me to check the backyard. He's planting unapproved structures and refuses to follow the rules. That's a violation of community standards, and as president of the HOA, I demand action." The second officer, a shorter woman who already looked skeptical, turned to me. "Sir, is this property part of an HOA?" "No," I said, calm but firm. "This house is not included in the HOA boundaries. That was confirmed before I bought it. She's been harassing me since the day I moved in, claiming authority she doesn't have." Karen gasped as if I had just lied to a priest. "Don't listen to him. Every single home on this street is under our jurisdiction. He's just trying to get away with breaking the rules. I've dealt with people like this before. They think they're special, but they're not." The taller officer glanced at me. "Do you have proof that your property isn't part of the HOA?" Without hesitation, I opened my folder and handed him the plat map and deed copies from the county clerk's office. "Here, official records. You'll see clearly that my parcel is excluded from the HOA. She's been sending me threatening letters and trying to enter my property without permission." The officers looked over the paperwork carefully, flipping between pages. The woman nodded first. "This looks legitimate. The lot is clearly outside the HOA boundary." Karen's face went pale, then red again. "No, that's impossible. You don't understand. If you let him get away with this, it will ruin everything. He'll let his lawn grow wild, or paint his shutters purple, or put up a 10-foot statue of a flamingo in the yard. We'll be living in chaos." I couldn't resist. "You're really afraid of flamingos, huh?" Even the officers cracked a small smile at that. But Karen wasn't laughing. She stepped forward, her voice rising. You have to make him comply. He's lying, I know he is. I've been president of this HOA for 10 years, and no one has ever dared defy me. The shorter officer's tone hardened. Ma'am, you need to calm down. We've reviewed the documentation. This property is not under your HOA's jurisdiction. You cannot demand access to it, and you cannot enforce your rules here. If you continue to harass this gentleman, you could face charges for trespassing or harassment. For a moment, Karen froze, her mouth hanging open. Then she let out a sound that was somewhere between a scoff and a scream. This is outrageous. You're supposed to protect this community, not enable people to destroy it. The taller officer raised a hand. Ma'am, that's enough. This isn't your property, and this isn't your call. If you don't leave this man alone, we'll have to take further action. You could practically see the gears turning in her head as she weighed her options. Her fists clenched, her jaw tightened, and her eyes darted between the officers and me. Finally, she spun around with a sharp huff, muttering loud enough for everyone to hear, Fine, but don't come crying to me when this place turns into a junkyard. She stormed off down the driveway, stomping so hard I half expected to see cracks form in the pavement. The officers watched her retreat, then turned back to me. The woman gave a sympathetic smile. Sorry about that. We get these kinds of calls more often than you'd think. Some HOA leaders take their jobs a little too seriously. That's putting it mildly, I said, shaking my head. Thanks for handling it. I really appreciate it. The tall officer handed me back my documents. No problem. Just keep these handy in case she tries again. And if she shows up on your property without your permission, give us a call immediately. You have every right to tell her to leave. After a few more reassurances, they returned to their cruiser and drove off, leaving the street in relative peace again. For a moment, I just stood there on my porch, the adrenaline finally draining from my body. I glanced across the street where Karen's house loomed like a fortress. Her blinds twitched, and I could swear I saw her silhouette pacing furiously back and forth. I half expected her to try again the next day, but something had changed. The sight of the police siding with me, shutting her down in front of the whole neighborhood, had clipped her wings. She no longer came storming up my driveway, no longer shoved notes in my mailbox. Instead, she resorted to glares, whispers, and passive-aggressive muttering whenever I passed by. The neighbors, however, were another story. It turned out that Karen's meltdown had been the entertainment of the week. One by one, people started approaching me at the mailbox, on the sidewalk, while walking their dogs. They would glance around nervously before leaning in to whisper, "Good for you for standing up to her." Others chuckled and admitted they'd always wanted to, but didn't have the nerve. Some even offered to help with yard projects or invited me to barbecues, as if my defiance had earned me honorary status in the unspoken anti-Karen alliance. It was strange, but in a way, I felt like her tantrum had done me a favor. By trying to ostracize me, she had actually made me part of the community. People saw me as the one who had stood up to the self-appointed dictator of the block. And while I knew she would probably never forgive me for existing outside her control, I also knew that she could never touch me. I had the law, the paperwork, and now the neighborhood on my side. That night, as I sat on my back porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, I thought about the absurdity of it all. A woman so desperate for control that she'd called the police just to force her way into my backyard. A situation that could have been a nightmare, but instead had ended with her being humiliated in front of her peers. I smiled, sipped my coffee, and looked at the flowers I had planted, the same flowers she'd tried to stop me from putting in the ground. They were blooming already, small bursts of color defying her rigid world of uniform lawns and matching shutters. To me, they weren't just flowers anymore. They were a victory,